Hello, everyone, and welcome to How to Niche Your Genre and Publish. We chose that title especially just so that we could get two French words into one title. I'll let you figure out which ones those are. I'm really happy to be here today with Stephen Oliver. He's going to be talking to us about his experience as a writer. So, welcome, Stephen. It's so nice to be here with you. Why don't you tell our listeners and our viewers what it is that you write?
Well, I actually have a book already published, a non-fiction book. That's, I don't know if you can see it.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, but that is in the self-help genre. But since then, I've been concentrating mainly on fiction. And this is where we have a slight problem because my fiction doesn't really completely fit into a single box.
Yeah, well, tell us a little bit about the project that you're writing right now. And
right,
then
I was just going to say,
the genre.
The project is a collection of short stories called Paranormal City. I wrote a story which was basically a fantasy, urban fantasy, I believe they call it, where we have a private detective who is at the same time also half angel, half demon. And so there's a little touch of noir in there, there's urban fantasy, it gets quite dark, there's black magic in there and all sorts of things. So in general, it's a little bit outside of the normal classification of genre. I'll get into that when I start talking about things. I realized I'd actually created an entire universe with this idea, so I started writing other stories. Annalise and I have almost finished the first book, editing it, and we're preparing it for publication at the beginning of next year. Then there's already a second book in place that's going to be, we're starting on as soon as we've done the first one, and I'm 55% through the third book.
So, Stephen, as you said, you and I are working together. We're working together on this collection of short stories, and I have an actual agent in mind for your project who I've already talked to about you. So that's where we're headed. Just so you know where Stephen is in that process. Let's jump in and talk about genre. So you were talking about genre, and somebody emailed me today about this presentation and said, I don't really feel like what I'm writing fits in a genre. And so many people feel that way, and I can talk a little bit from the publishing side, what we use genres for and why they even exist, if it's so dang hard for writers to figure out where they sit. But let's talk first about your experience as the writer, because I know that your genre is really, really, really specific. And I know that you've prepared some things to tell us about how you got there.
Okay.
And found your place in the world, because I think that would be interesting for writers to hear your experience as a writer.
Okay. Well, first of all, the first question that a lot of people probably ask when they're coming in and starting out as writers is, what exactly is genre? Now, the thing is, it speaks very deeply to something that is completely human, and that is our tendency to go pigeonholing. We need to put things into connections. Again, going back to this mind map, each of these individual lines I have here is like its own little pigeonhole, which has its own pigeonholes within it. But we do this. As Annalisa was saying, this is something that's very important for publishers, because you need to go out and you're selling a particular genre or subgenre or sub-sub or sub-sub, as deep as you want to go. But it's not something that, as a writer, we always need to consider. For instance, as a pantser, and I'll admit that from the beginning, I find the story fits itself. And I'll get down to this when I'm defining how we define what a genre is. But it's something that a story, if you're going to write a story, unless you're going for a specific market, for instance, you're trying to write for an anthology on As I saw recently, an anthology came out, it was about lesbian vampire killers. Strange though that may sound, there is actually a subgenre for that. But the whole point is, we need to classify. You know, we do that every time we look at someone. We say, "Oh, he's a Republican. She's Chinese. She's blonde, or whatever." And the thing is, that's very good, but it means everything gets pushed together with everything else in the same box, which can be a problem, because you've then got to stand out even more as a writer if your genre is science fiction. Which brings me to my next point. How do we define genre? It's a classification, as I said. I'm writing fantasy stories. Now, my fantasy stories are a little bit mixed up. There's elements of science fiction in there. There's horror. There's all sorts of things. But I want to throw a couple of names at you, and I want you to think what genre these three names belong to. You may not know all of them. They are Isaac Asimov, Ray Bradbury, and Harlan Ellison. If you go into almost any bookshop or even Amazon, you'll find them under science fiction, but they are very, very different. Science fiction, hard science fiction, was a speciality of Isaac Asimov, but the man did a lot more than that. I've read books by him about science, about sociology, pretty much everything else. He wrote an annotated version of Shakespeare's plays. He did the same with Chaucer's plays. And in fact, I remember reading, he said once, he got some very interesting letters like, "You're such a brilliant Chaucer scholar. Why do you stoop so low as to write science fiction?" And then the next letter came in and it said, "You're only a science fiction writer. How do you dare to have the gall to write about the brilliant Shakespeare?" Mm-hmm. And that's the whole point is, he was a man who spanned everything fiction and non-fiction. It's unbelievable. If you haven't read any of his non-fiction work, I recommend it. He had a way of explaining things so clearly. But the funny thing is, the other two, and these, by the way, are people who are among my inspirations. For Asimov, for instance, was the clarity of his writing. He wasn't very good at characterization, but he was excellent at getting his ideas across. And as he said, the wonderful thing was he discovered he could type at 90 words a minute, and he thought at 90 words a minute. So, now, Ray Bradbury, people know him, for instance, for The Martian Chronicles. I don't know if anyone has ever watched that TV series.
No, read the book.
Read the book, okay, same thing. But he wrote a lot of other things which, although they have a fantasy element in them, are very much about Middle America in the 40s, 50s, even the 30s, which was when he grew up. But there's a strong fantasy element in there, and something else which I discovered quite late on, because I hadn't read, my first books were R is for Rocket and S is for Space, both of which are by Bradbury. But the whole point is that when I came back to them later, I discovered there is also a very strong religious element in his words. He's looking from the point of view, in some ways, of the mystic and the religious man. Harlan Ellison, again, I don't know if everyone knows him, is a brilliant writer, but his speciality is the psychology, if you like. As he puts it in one book, our mortal dreads, the things we are afraid of. It's from, I think it was in All the Sounds of Fear. And he was very much a passionate man about who we are and what it means to be a human being, and how a human being can destroy themselves. So, these are in the genre of science fiction, but you're already having to go down into lower levels, which brings me to the other side of my writing, and that is the horror and dark fantasy, although nowadays horror is often classified as dark fantasy. Again, a couple of names to throw at you: H.P. Lovecraft, Mary Shelley, and of course, Stephen King. And if you like, you can throw in Dean Koontz and Graham Masterton and those people as well. Lovecraft, I mean, he was writing way back in the 20s and 30s and was very much a pulp fiction writer. But the funny thing is, you listen to some of the top writers today, King, Masterton, Kuntz, all of these people, and they will all say the same thing. Lovecraft is one of their greatest influences because he had a vision of horror that few people have been able to match since, because his horror was what, for want of a better word, you could call cosmic horror. His view was the universe doesn't care about us in any shape or form. His monsters, they're not evil, they're just so powerful, we are less than nothing to them. And we are to be thrown away, to be used and then gone. And then we come to another classification, and that is Gothic horror. And that's where Mary Shelley, with her Frankenstein, of course, was absolutely brilliant. In fact, I do reference her in one of my stories. The fact that that story, people don't realize it, but the original story of Frankenstein is 200 years old. And yet it still has the power to horrify us, because this is Gothic horror. Now, the thing is, why use these genres? Why split it up? It's because we pigeonhole. We refine things. We start off, I'm writing, so my first decision was, what am I going to write? Stepwise refinement. First step, it's going to be in the fantasy, but is it going to be fantasy? Is it going to be science fantasy, for want of a better word? I.e., is there going to be a scientific basis to it, or is it, I'm just going to describe the world and let people work out whether there is a scientific basis for themselves? So, decision, fantasy. Subgenre, are we talking about ancient fantasy, as in, I don't know, let's say The Elf King by Dunsany, or if we're talking about something based in medieval times, like in some ways Game of Thrones. Or in my case, I decided I'm going to do modern fantasy. So then again, you've got to think, split further down. Am I going to do horror? I've got some elements of horror in there. Paranormal, I've got some psychic people in there. Or urban fantasy, which, for those who don't know, is horror in the modern world, in cities, literally. But then again, there are subgenres of that, which I'm sure you know. There's the vampire subgenre, which you get Twilight and so on. There's the shifters. There's so many books there about werewolves, weredeers, whatever. Witches and wizards, where if you want something like that, then a good place to start is with the Dresden Files, which was a very good television series, but the books are also very good. And again, the paranormal can be within the urban setting. So we are already getting crossovers between horror and the paranormal, which are subgenres, and with subgenres of other subgenres. And this is where I am running in my in my world. So I'm mixing things up. For instance, I have one story where I have a policeman who is at the same time a psychic. Just a minute, let's get me on the screen. He's a psychic, he's a magician, and he's also a cyborg. So I'm crossing sort of three different subgenres out of two major classes. I personally think the story quite well
there for a second, Stephen, because I want to highlight this conversation with yourself that you've just told us about, because I think that it's really important, and I could kind of envision your mind map as you were thinking about it. It sounds like you were really kind of taking yourself down and making some decisions. And those are, as I talk about in storytelling for Pantsers, like there's a moment where there's a yes, no decision. And that's in reference to story. But I think it works here when you're kind of in that meta plane, thinking about what your genre is. This conversation that you've outlined for us, it's like you kept coming to these forks in the road and you said, no, I'm going to go this way. No, I'm going to go this way. Is that really an accurate, I don't want to use this word lightly, outline of your thinking when you brainstormed this project?
No, this is very much a reconstruction of where my thoughts went when I was doing it. I was a little bit slowed down on my fantasy project. I also have another non-fiction project, which is a follow-on book to my original. It was a point where neither of those was really going anywhere. And I was thinking, well, what shall I do? And I had this idea. I'd just been watching some film noir on the television. I can't even remember what it was. And did that, and I thought, what would happen if this private detective had been an angel or a demon, or maybe both? And I went off and I wrote the story, and when the book's published, it's the first story in the book. Well, the version that we have, I don't know if that's what the publishers are going to end up with, but that's the way it started. And so the decisions were basically subconscious. This is an area where I've done quite a lot of reading over the years, and horror, science fiction. I mean, when I left Switzerland and came to the UK, I left a library of about 4,000 books behind, over half of which were fiction. So I've been doing a lot of reading. I mean, I also read a lot of crime stories, for instance. I think I've read just about every single Agatha Christie story she wrote, long, short. I even read the original play of The Mousetrap, which I don't know if you know, but it's the longest running theatre production in the world. It's been running for over 50 years in London. And every few months they change the ending, so it's a different criminal behind it. But if you read the original play, it actually gives you the pointers on how to reconstruct everything so that it goes differently. She really thought about it. So the whole point is that, I have a lot of influences coming in, and a lot of these decisions, like so many of my decisions when I'm doing my writing, are unconscious, I suppose. I wrote the story and then reconstructed it, because when I wrote the next story, it was something similar, and then the next story, okay, those three could belong together, but then the story after I wrote that, I suddenly got vampires in it.
Mm-hmm.
That's that little short one that goes in between that I've called Vampires Aren't Just Leeches on Two Legs, which is a little bit tongue-in-cheek, I suppose. And then, the thing is, so many of these ideas they come as the story is being written. I've literally just finished one yesterday. It's called Why I Drink, and it's a ghost story, but it's also a bit of film noir, or sort of a noir story in there, because it's about a young man who helps a ghost find out who killed them.
Interesting.
So, sorry, go on.
Well, I'm just thinking, like, your train of thought, whether it was kind of real time back when you were making the decision, or if it's something that you've kind of reconstructed for us. Either way, I think that it's a really good tip for our listeners and for our viewers in how they can start to think about where their piece is placed, like just reconstructing that kind of thinking and making those kind of choices around what they're doing.
Yeah.
So what tips can you give based on your experience and your process for the people who are listening?
Well, the first tip I can give you is, if, like me, you're a pantser, let the story develop itself. In fact, that was the next point I was going to come to. And that is using genre. It's defining, if you like, the area you're going to be working in. But the whole point is, are you going to be working deliberately within an area, or are you going to be moving into an area you do not perhaps define when you're starting, as I did? And most of my stories, they all fit in. Nowadays, when I get a new idea, the first filter that runs through my head is, will it fit in my paranormal city?
Mm-hmm.
I've got a huge collection of prompts. Many of them are my own. Some of them I've picked up from online sources. I bought quite a few books. The thing is, with prompt books, you get 100 prompts and maybe you can use 2 or 3 if you're lucky. There are also 1 or 2 out there. There's one actually I gave a 1-star review to because his English was so bad that I was literally having to try and translate where he was coming from. So after 20 out of 1,000 tips, the book has never been opened since. But the whole idea is every time you have a tip, an idea, something you've come through, you need to think about what genre is this going to be in. Is it where I'm writing right now? Or is it something I can write later? Or is it something I can adapt? I mean, the story I just said, Why I Don't Drink, that was going to be originally just a ghost story. It's just that the noir aspects came in when I got some corrupt police involved in the story.
That's a really good point, Stephen, because I think that one of the things that writers struggle with a lot, and one of the things that you're really good at, is versatility. So you're able to take a piece, like you just said, that might start somewhere and morph it into where you want to go, right? Which is the intersection of being a pantser, yay, like allowing creativity to just kind of run amok like a naughty toddler, and then kind of like bringing in some discipline to say, that's really nice, naughty toddler of creativity, but we still need to get ready to go out the door. Yeah. So tell us a little bit about, if you're following my analogy, like stepping in and being that parent, like what does that look like for you, that relationship that you have between creativity and kind of moving your piece in a certain direction?
Well, very often, sometimes I will know where it's going. For instance, about a third of the way through this story I was just saying, I had a scene in my head, but I realized that was almost like an epilogue to the story. But that then gave me a direction I would be moving in, if you understand what I mean. It gave me an aim to go to. But in other stories, my bringing in the discipline has been much more a case of sitting down after I'd written it. What I do is, I've got my Kindle here, I upload the stories onto the Kindle and I do my first revisions on there. And that's when I then start the discipline and going, no, you don't really say it that way, or, you need to add something in here. There needs to be a foreshadowing, or there needs to be a backlink to something earlier in the story. And that's when the discipline comes in. And that's when I start looking at it from the point of view of what is the story structure, what is the outline, if you like, where is the story coming from, where is it going? My fantasy story, for instance, I already have the scene in my head, how it's going to finish. No problem at all. It's how the 100,000 or whatever words that still need to come between those two parts, how that is going to evolve. And again, the funny thing is, when I started that book, I was worried it was going to be about 40,000 words long. I'm 57,000 words into the story, and I'm maybe 25% through my storyline. So I could end up with a Stephen King monster, if you know what I mean.
This is really, really interesting to hear you say, because I know that you're a first-class pantser, and writing with an aim in mind. And, I hear you saying a bunch of different types of aims, and I just want to parse those out for the people who are listening, because sometimes you might know the ending, right? So you're like, I'm going to write a love story, and at the end, they're not going to fall in love. That's going to be my story, right? So I know the ending. Or as Stephen did, you might get an idea. I'm going to write about a police officer who's both an angel and a demon, right? That's just a concept. You have no plot, you have no ideas, you have no theme. You're just going to explore, what does that look like? But your only aim at that point is, what is this character? What happens to a character like this in the world? And so one of the things that I think that you do well, Stephen, is to really set that aim or that goal for yourself. So what you're doing really, and this is a good tip for the listeners, is you're giving yourself enough structure that you're not just kind of free falling out into creativity land, but you're allowing enough room for whatever to happen. I suspect, Stephen, that when you sat down to write about a police officer who's an angel and a devil, that you didn't know what was going to happen to this person, or if it would end up in the end being both an angel and a devil, or maybe one of them was stronger, or maybe they're not a devil at all. I bet you didn't know those things. Those were the things that you were exploring in the initial phases, and giving yourself permission to just say, what if and see what happens, and also to change your mind, right? So in my story where I say, I'm going to sit down and write a story about two people in love, but at the end they're not going to be in love. Well, I might get 3/4 of the way through that story and decide, well, actually that seemed like a good idea at the beginning, but I want them to stay in love because it's going to serve my story better. So to kind of change your mind in that way. So I mean, we've diverged a bit from genre, but I think that like thinking about how story is constructed, this is something that's a real strength for you as a writer. So I just want to take a moment to point that out. So we're about halfway through, and I want to get back because I know you've got that mind map. So let's hop back into genre. What else did you want to share about your experience in?
Well, my point is, we're all going to be ending up in a genre somewhere if we publish. You can use it, and this is the third point I wanted to get through to, is that the question you need to ask yourself is, am I selecting a genre, or is the genre going to be selecting me? And this has so much to do with the way you're writing and also what you're trying to aim for. If you're trying to write a love story, you don't really want to start off with somebody being killed most horribly, although that might be a very interesting start. I would love to read a story that starts off with a murder and ends up with two people getting married. Who knows? The amateur detective and the policewoman working together find they like each other enough to get married. I don't know. That's I'm just throwing that out if anyone wants to write a story like that. But my stories, even if I have an aim, and that happened, for instance, with a short story I wrote last Christmas. It was in a writing group, and they said, write something for Christmas. And I was struck by the similarity, or the fact that the word Satan and Santa are both anagrams. And so I wanted to write a story, and I started off the story, and in 1,500 words, changed direction 5 times. Because that's how the story evolved. How did Santa end up in the particular situation I put him in? Oh, that happened. Well, if that happened, then what are these people doing? Oh, he took them with him when he had to leave, etc., etc. So the story is an evolving piece, but it's still staying within the frame. But very often, when you're when you're writing, you might be writing for a particular market. You might want to do, I don't know, maybe fan fiction about Twilight, or you've decided, as I did, it didn't actually start out that way, to write a story about a descendant of Victor Frankenstein and what he's doing in the modern world. And you know which story I'm talking about, Annalisa.
I do.
So the thing is, be careful. Genre is excellent because, as a way of giving you a framework, because a genre will tell you things you need to have in there. If you're going to be talking about vampires, then you're going to need bitten necks or some other way of predation on the human race. Or as one excellent story I read, it was called Dayblood. I believe it was by Larry Niven, where it was someone who feeds off vampires. Interesting idea. But the whole point is, you're working with a genre, you know how it's expected. If you're going to do gothic horrors, you're going to have castles, you're going to have creepy old houses, you're going to have ghosts wandering around in chains. Those are things that people are going to expect. I like taking a story and what people expect and then turning it a little bit on its head. But the whole thing is, you still need to have those aspects in there, otherwise people are going to say, well, that was a load of rubbish. That's not what I was expecting at all. So, it can be a strength. I'm aiming at this, or it can be a limitation. I'm trying to do this, but the story doesn't want me to do that. And then you need to rethink, am I perhaps writing in the wrong genre? Am I going to force it? Because the interesting thing is, there's more and more cross-genre things coming. I'm thinking of I've never read it, but I saw recently an advert for a book called Pride and Prejudice and Zombies, where they've taken Pride and Prejudice, which of course is long out of copyright, and they've added zombie themes into it. Now, is that coming as literature? Just literature? or as they call it, literary fiction nowadays, I believe? Or is it horror? Or is it tongue-in-cheek? You're reading this and going, yeah. Or is it meant as humor? That's something we're going to have to take into account, that the genres are getting, the edges and the barriers between them are beginning to fall apart, and people are slipping from one to the other. And I think you saying that I'm very specific, but in some ways, some of my stories are sort of pushing the edges out a bit and sliding a little bit into other areas.
Yeah, that's really interesting, and I think that's helpful. So, Stephen, let's talk a little bit about your journey, because one of the questions that writers ask me most frequently on Facebook, at writers' conferences, wherever, is, what does this look like? How do I become an author? How do I move from writer to author? What's the journey? So I know a little bit about your journey because we've been working together, but
Yep.
Tell people who are listening, what did your life look like, your writing life, look like before we were working together, and sort of up until the point that you decided that working with a writing coach was a good idea?
Well, I suppose we can probably go back 40 years. When I was at school, I wanted to be a writer at school. I had an English teacher who really destroyed my aspirations, I suppose. We were supposed to, over the summer holidays, we were supposed to write a multi-chapter story. And I did. It was a science fiction story. I had just discovered science fiction. Was about 13 years old, I suppose. And I wrote this story about a grand tour of the solar system. I mean, scientifically completely rubbish, but really good fun. I thoroughly enjoyed writing it. And he collected them in the beginning of term, and a couple of weeks ago he came back and was saying, nice little story about your summer holidays, nice little murder mystery. Stephen, what is this rubbish you're writing? Don't do this sort of stupid thing again. Which for a young teenager is really crushes your aspiration. I tried later in my teens and my early 20s to do it, and nothing really happened. And then in the early 90s, I went on an I discovered afterwards an NLP course, and it was called Write On, by a man called Peter Vricher. And it was freeing up your writer, because he believed everyone can write, maybe not as well as others, or maybe better. And I wrote a simple little story, which actually appears, I've put into the end of the second book. And it's called The Bargain. And it was written in half an hour, because we had to do, the exercise was, you've got 10 minutes to write, and I'm giving you the first sentence. Once upon a time, there was a man. Write, just write. Don't stop, don't think, just write. Mm-hmm. And after 10 minutes, he said, stop, write. Finish your sentence. Next, once upon a time, there was a woman. Start writing. So I started writing. And they said, stop. The man met the woman. I said, that's not going to work. He said, the woman met the man. I said, that's not going to work. They've already met. And I wrote this story. It's an allegory. But it was real fun in half an hour, because then I had to read it to somebody else, and they insisted I read it out to the group. And that's when I realized maybe I am a writer. But it took me over 20 years before I sat down, nearly 20 years, and sat down and had the guts to actually write a book. And that's the one I just showed you at the beginning, which is based on my experiences of actually designing a course on goal setting. A friend of mine needed a goal setting course she was learning to be, what's the word I'm looking for? Alexander teacher. And she realized they weren't teaching about setting goals. Nobody knew about it. So she and I and another friend sat together and we designed the course. I did all the main work, because I was the only one who actually knew how to run a computer at the time. This was at the end of the noughties. And then nothing happened. Nobody was interested in the course, so it just died. And then a few years later, I said to her, look, I'm interested in writing this as a book. Is that okay? And she said, yeah, fine, you've got all the materials, you know, you can have them. And then I wrote the book and I published it in 2013, first on the as a Kindle book and then as a paperback. And in the years since then, I've done it as an iBook and also sent it to Smashwords, although I've got to do some revamping there because they say they don't like my formatting. But the point is, I've been through this. I've gone my own way. I've been an indie, so to speak.
Yeah. So, I mean, that's really interesting because it sounds like there were several thresholds that you had to get over. You know, one was, you know, being crushed by a teacher and then kind of overcoming that emotional experience and accepting that you're a writer. And then the next step was actually writing a nonfiction book. And now you're in a new phase of your life where you're really embracing your inner writer, to the point where you were serious enough to make an investment in your writing.
Yeah.
And so, like, if you could illustrate for us or describe kind of taking that step up onto that third step to say, you know, I embrace my writer, I'm going to publish this fiction that I'm in love with. What did it look like to get you up over that hump onto the next step?
Was a number of things. First of all, I sent my book out to various people, friends or friends of friends. It actually all started when I was at my sister's birthday party and a school friend of hers was there. And I was talking about, she said, "What are you doing?" I said, "Oh, I'm writing these days." And she said, "Well, what are you writing?" So I gave her one of my stories. I had my Kindle with me at the time. And I said, "Read that." And she read it. It was only 4 or 5 pages long. And at the end of it, she went, "Wow, you know, that's really good. Do you have any more?" And I said, "I've got a whole book. Do you have a Kindle reader?" And she said, "I've got one at home." So I got her email address. I sent it to her. And about a month later, she wrote back and said, "You are a dark horse, aren't you? I never imagined you had this in you." And I thought, "What in me?" She said, "I didn't realize you had such dark thoughts." And that's when I realized there was something that people might like. I mean, I'd just done it literally just for the fun of it. That's how I started. It was just, I enjoyed doing it, the creativity. I've always been creative. In the software world, there are people using software. There's an insurance company, for instance, in Switzerland. I saved them about 2.5 years' wages per year with some software I wrote, and it only cost them about $20,000 by the time I'd finished. So I've always been creative. I've always had creative solutions. And I've always dreamt, I've had weird dreams. Actually, there's one novel I'm going to write. I've got the notes down for it, but I haven't got round to it, which all came out of a dream, literally a single dream. And I expanded the whole world out of that. And in fact, nowadays, if I come up with a weird dream, that goes down into my notebook because, hey, my subconscious is probably trying to tell me something.
Yeah, that's really.
And there was this excitement going on, and then I was on there. I got onto Facebook. I was on your Facebook page. I suddenly decided I'm going to go and be more active in the writers' world, see how other people are doing, and then I think it all started when you put up the what do you call it? The advanced reader copy of Writing for Pantsers, or Storytelling for Pantsers, rather. And that's when I realized, my God, this woman understands me more than anyone else. And that's when I then approached you and said, "Can you help me?" You know, especially when you said, you know people in the publishing trade, you can help me with other aspects of it, the publishing, I suppose the marketing and so on, if we get to that point.
When we get to that point.
Huh?
When we get to that point.
When? No, I didn't. At the time, it was an if, because I didn't know. Now I know you do, but the whole point was, and then I decided, and little sidebar, one of my favorite people when it comes to writing is a man called Dr. Joe Vitale. I don't know if the name means anything to you. He is a self-help guru. He was, I think in the 80s and even the 90s, he was homeless, literally homeless. And he's now a multimillionaire because he learned how to use something called the law of attraction and how people think. And he's written some amazing books. He has also done something else amazing. He has produced records, he has written songs, got together some really top musicians to work with him, and he has produced albums of songs. And one that I just happened to be listening to that day is called Shock Yourself. And he says basically, if you want to make that jump forwards into the future, you need to shock yourself. You need to say, I'm prepared to invest $10,000. I'm prepared to take the time, 2 years of my life, and take evening classes. I'm prepared to go up to that woman and say, I think you're very nice. Will you go out with me? Whatever. Give yourself a shock and kick yourself in the pants. And that's what this was. And I admit, working with you, that enthusiasm has just got bigger and bigger. And that's why I am writing more and more stories. I look after my 85-year-old mother. Okay, she's not incapable. We live together. She cooks, I drive. You know, we live together. We look after each other. But the whole point is, it leaves me a lot of time for writing, and that leaves me a lot of time for thinking and for creating and all this thing. And this journey has just become a journey of massive creation for me, to the point where, you know, I'm quite honestly, I'm almost in tears here thinking about what I can do and the excitement that can do it. You know, you can have happy tears.
Yeah.
I'm actually almost having happy tears here.
Wow.
Because that is what that is. I think this is what I'm now in the world to do. 20 years ago, 10 years ago, I was in the world to help people with their problems in the computer world. Now I'm here in the world to entertain people, to make them think that, you know, things are maybe not a little bit different to what they really think. You know, the world isn't prosaic. There's a wonderful series of graphic novels called Planetary by Vertigo. And there's a phrase that occurs again and again. This is a strange world. Let's keep it that way. For me, it's become a case of this is a magical, creative world. Let's keep it that way.
Yeah. Oh, that's so beautiful, Stephen. Thank you for sharing that with all the people listening. And, you know, I'm a writing coach. That's my job title. And I help people to write and publish novels. That's what I do. But what I really do is what you just said, right? I get them into this creative space, this space where they really feel like they're in that powerful life force of creative flow. And they're loving what they do. They're getting their message out into the world. And then they get to see their name on the cover of a book and they get to sign.
That's a bonus.
I mean, it's just like it's one powerful thing after another. It's just
Exactly.
It's really beautiful. It's really beautiful. Oh, Stephen, you're going to make me cry too. Don't stop. Yeah. Oh my gosh. Well, thank you, Stephen, so much for sharing your passion, your vision, and your wisdom with everyone listening. I appreciate you so, 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 so much.